In the spring of 1945, in a crowded American processing center in southern Germany, a line of exhausted women stood shoulder to shoulder under the dim light of a school gymnasium. Their uniforms were stained with mud and sweat. Their faces were hollow from hunger. Some were nurses from military hospitals. Some were clerks from Luftwaffe offices. Some were teenage auxiliaries who had spent the last months carrying messages and tending the wounded. They had survived air raids, artillery, and the collapse of the Third Reich. Yet nothing prepared them for what happened next. At one end of the room, U.S. Army medics stood beside folding chairs and buzzing electric clippers. Piles of dark blonde and brown hair were already gathering on the wooden floor. The women watched in stunned silence as one prisoner after another sat down and rose again nearly bald. Whispers spread through the line. Was this punishment? Revenge? Humiliation? Several women began to cry. One later remembered the moment with a single sentence that captured the misery of the final war years. We had lice for 18 months. The Americans were not trying to shame them. They were fighting an enemy far older and more dangerous than any rifle or tank. It was crawling through the seams of uniforms, hidden in blankets, feeding on blood, and carrying disease. In that crowded room in May 1945, the war against Nazi Germany had ended. But another battle was just beginning. To understand why these women reacted with such fear, it helps to go back to the last 18 months of the war. In late 1943, Germany was already under enormous strain. Allied bombers struck cities night and day, the Eastern Front swallowed entire divisions, railway lines were overloaded, coal was scarce. Soap became difficult to find. Hot water was no longer guaranteed. In military hospitals and barracks, women serving as nurses and auxiliaries worked around the clock, often sleeping in their uniforms. At first, lice seemed like a minor irritation, a few bites at the collar, scratching at night, but lice multiply quickly when people are crowded together and cannot wash regularly. Eggs cling to hair and clothing. In heated rooms and dirty bedding, they spread from one person to another with ruthless efficiency. By early 1944, infestation had become common in field hospitals, refugee trains, and temporary shelters. Women serving with organizations such as the Wehrmachthelferinnen, the female auxiliaries attached to the German armed forces, were particularly vulnerable. They operated radios, typed reports, and staffed communication centers close to the front. Many were young, often between 17 and 25 years old. They had grown up in an orderly society that valued appearance and discipline. Most had never experienced anything like the conditions of total war. When Soviet offensives smashed German lines in the east during 1944, thousands of women were evacuated westward. They packed what they could carry and boarded overcrowded trains. Cars intended for 40 people held more than 100. Windows were broken. Toilets failed. Travelers slept sitting upright, pressed against strangers for days. Lice passed silently from coat to coat. One former auxiliary later recalled feeling insects moving along the back of her neck while the train stood outside Breslau during an air raid. She could do nothing. Water was rationed. There was no place to wash. The scratching became constant. Sleep became almost impossible. By January 1945, the crisis had deepened. On January 12, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive. German defenses collapsed across Poland. Millions of civilians fled westward in freezing temperatures. Women pulled children on sleds. Nurses pushed carts of medical supplies through snow. Many slept in barns or open fields. Clothing remained damp for days. Lice flourished in these conditions. The problem was more than discomfort. Body lice can carry epidemic typhus, a deadly disease caused by the bacterium Rickettsia prowazekii. Fever, rash, and delirium follow. In weakened populations, mortality can be severe. Military leaders understood this threat all too well. During earlier wars, typhus had killed enormous numbers of soldiers and civilians. For Allied medical officers in 1945, any large concentration of prisoners represented a potential outbreak. As Germany crumbled, many women were cut off from normal support. Hospitals lost electricity, laundries stopped operating, soap disappeared from supply lists. Some women tried to remove lice by boiling uniforms in metal pots. Others used vinegar or kerosene. None of these methods worked for long when they returned to infested shelters. Then came the final collapse. In April 1945, U.S. forces crossed deep into southern Germany. United States Army units such as the 3rd Infantry Division and 12th Armored Division captured towns and military facilities across Bavaria and Württemberg. Columns of German soldiers and auxiliaries surrendered in large numbers. Among them were thousands of women. Many expected brutal treatment. Nazi propaganda had spent years warning Germans about enemy revenge. Instead, most were disarmed, searched, and directed to temporary collection points. These could be school buildings, warehouses, or fenced open fields. Conditions were crowded but organized. American guards enforced order while medical personnel inspected prisoners for wounds and disease. At one processing center near Regensburg in early May 1945, U.S. Army sanitary teams faced a difficult situation. Hundreds of women arrived carrying blankets and satchels. Many had visible nits in their hair. Others were covered in bite marks. Their clothing had not been properly washed in months. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, but disease did not obey surrender documents. The sanitary officer in charge would have followed established procedures. Prisoners were separated by category, directed to bathing facilities, and issued delousing powder, often containing DDT, which the Allies used extensively by 1945. Clothing was steamed or chemically treated. In severe infestations, hair was cut short or shaved to remove eggs attached near the scalp. To the American medics, this was routine preventive medicine. To the German women, it was terrifying. Hair carried deep personal meaning. In wartime photographs, female auxiliaries often appear with carefully arranged curls tucked under caps. Even during hardship, many tried to maintain some sense of dignity through grooming. After months of fear and deprivation, their hair was one of the few remaining parts of their identity they still controlled. Now that control was gone. The women stood in line, watching electric clippers pass over one scalp after another. Locks fell to the floor in thick clumps. Some prisoners pleaded to keep their hair. Others sat rigid and silent. Several covered their faces when they stood up. One nurse later remembered feeling colder than she had during winter retreats in East Prussia. The American medics worked quickly. A white sheet was draped around each woman's shoulders. Clippers buzzed from forehead to neck. Remaining stubble was checked for nits. Then the prisoner moved to showers, where hot water and soap were provided. For many, it was the first true bath in months. The emotional shock was immediate. A woman who had endured artillery fire without tears might begin sobbing at the sight of her hair on the floor. Another stared at her reflection and barely recognized herself. Rumors spread that they were being marked permanently as defeated enemies. Yet as the day continued, another feeling emerged: relief. The itching stopped. Fresh blankets replaced the old ones crawling with insects. Clean clothing no longer scratched at the skin. For the first time in 18 months, some women slept through the night without waking to scratch until they bled. American medical doctrine treated hygiene as a strategic necessity. During the war, U.S. forces developed highly organized sanitation procedures. Mobile bath units, laundries, and delousing stations followed advancing armies. DD, introduced in military use during the mid-1940s, proved remarkably effective against lice and helped prevent outbreaks in liberated camps and prisoner enclosures. The women, however, did not know these details as they entered the processing center. All they saw were foreign soldiers and clippers. One former communications clerk later described her surprise at the professionalism of the U.S. medics. They did not laugh. They did not insult the prisoners. They moved with the detached efficiency of men handling a medical emergency. This mattered. In a moment that felt deeply personal and humiliating, the tone of the Americans signaled that the purpose was practical, not punitive. The broader context was grim. Across Europe in 1945, millions of displaced persons, concentration camp survivors, prisoners of war, and refugees were on the move. Overcrowding and malnutrition created ideal conditions for epidemic disease. Allied authorities feared typhus almost as much as lingering armed resistance. Delousing centers became a common feature of post-war administration. For German women prisoners, the shaving marked a psychological turning point. Until then, many still hoped the collapse might somehow be temporary. Some believed they would soon return to their former lives. Seeing themselves shorn and stripped of military identity forced a harsher realization. The world they had known was gone. Yet this moment also represented a return to basic human care. For months, survival had depended on endurance alone. Now strangers provided soap, hot water, and medical attention. The same women who initially saw the clippers as instruments of humiliation began to understand them as tools of protection. Several memoirs written after the war mention the profound sensation of cleanliness. It is a small detail, but an important one. In military history, attention often centers on tanks, aircraft, and battles. Less visible are the physical burdens carried by ordinary people: hunger, exhaustion, and infestation. Lice reduced individuals to constant discomfort. They disrupted sleep, infected wounds, and eroded morale. Removing them restored more than hygiene. It restored a sense of bodily control. The symbolism of hair remained powerful. In many cultures, forced hair cutting is associated with punishment or disgrace. For these women, that association was real and immediate. But unlike acts intended to shame, this procedure was applied systematically as a medical measure. The distinction did not erase the emotional pain, but it changed how many later remembered the experience. One woman, captured near Augsburg, wrote that she cried when her braids were cut, but admitted that she felt reborn after the shower. Another recalled touching her bare scalp under a clean blanket and realizing she no longer felt insects moving. She said that was the first night since 1943 when she slept without fear. American soldiers also observed the condition of surrendered personnel with a mixture of surprise and sympathy. Many had expected disciplined enemy troops. Instead, they encountered underfed young women with worn uniforms and obvious signs of prolonged hardship. Some medics were struck by how normal they seemed, frightened, tired, and desperate for rest. This did not erase the larger realities of the war or the crimes committed by the Nazi regime. But at the level of the processing center, the immediate concern was straightforward: stop disease, stabilize the prisoners, keep thousands of people alive in the chaotic aftermath of surrender. As weeks passed, hair began to grow back. The shaved scalps that had seemed so shocking became less important than food, letters from home, and uncertainty about the future. Many women were eventually released after screening. They returned to cities in ruins and families scattered by death and displacement. Years later, when some were interviewed about their wartime experiences, they often remembered the shaving with surprising clarity, not because it was the worst thing they endured, but because it condensed the entire collapse into one unforgettable image: the floor covered in hair, the hum of clippers, the first hot shower, the sudden absence of itching. The phrase, "we had lice for 18 months," carries a truth often lost in broad historical narratives. The end of war was not only about treaties and surrender ceremonies, it was also about the condition of human bodies after years of deprivation. For many German women, captivity began with the loss of their hair, but it also began with the return of sanitation, sleep, and safety from disease. In that crowded gymnasium in southern Germany, the women believed they were about to be degraded by their captors. Instead, they were witnessing a practical act of wartime medicine. The Americans understood that a tiny parasite could kill just as surely as a bullet if left unchecked. You can almost hear the clippers in that room. You can see the women standing with blankets clutched to their chests, unsure of what the next minute will bring. You can feel the fear as the first strands fall to the floor. And then, after the shower, after the clean clothes, after the itching finally stops, another feeling takes its place. Relief. The war had taken their homes, their certainty, and much of their dignity. In a strange and painful way, the shaving of their heads marked the beginning of recovery. It was the moment when survival replaced ideology, when hygiene replaced propaganda, when defeat became undeniable, but so did the possibility of living on. That night, under American blankets in a converted schoolhouse, many of the women lay awake with hands resting on newly bare scalps. The room was quiet except for breathing, no scratching, no whispered complaints about insects, no crawling sensation along the neck. For the first time in 18 months, the invisible enemy was gone, and in that silence, more than in any formal surrender, they understood that the war was over.